On the morning of November 14, 1979, a maintenance crew at the Monongahela Valley Steel Works discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 11 bodies, scattered across the floor of Furnace Building 4, some near the sealed emergency exits, others huddled together in corners. All of them burned beyond recognition. The official cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation and thermal trauma. The temperature inside that building had reached 1400 degrees before the fire suppressed itself. 1400 degrees, hot enough to melt copper, hot enough to turn steel soft. The Allegheny County coroner called it the worst industrial accident in Pennsylvania history. The newspapers called it a tragedy. But the men who worked the picket lines outside those gates, they called it something else entirely. They called it justice. The 11 men who died that night were not steel workers. They were replacement workers, scabs, brought in from Kentucky and West Virginia to cross a picket line and take jobs that belonged to families who had worked those furnaces for 3 generations. The men responsible for their deaths were not criminals, not in the traditional sense. They were Stanley Kowalski and his 3 sons, 4th-generation steel workers, union men, veterans, fathers and husbands who had never been arrested, never been fired, never missed a Sunday Mass at Immaculate Heart of Mary. Stanley Kowalski was 53 years old. He had worked the open hearth for 31 years. His father had died in that same mill in 1952, crushed beneath a ladle car. His grandfather had helped build those furnaces in 1910, back when Polish was the only language spoken on the floor. And on the night of November 13, 1979, Stanley Kowalski locked 11 men inside the building where his family had bled and sweated and prayed for 7 decades. Then he walked away and let the furnace do what furnaces do. The reason? A wildcat strike that his own union refused to support. A picket line that the police helped scabs cross every morning. And the unbearable sight of strangers operating machines that still bore his father's handprints. This is the story of the Pittsburgh Furnace Massacre. The story of how a system designed to protect working men abandoned them completely. The story of how 11 families lost their fathers and sons. And the story of how one family decided that if the law would not deliver justice, they would deliver it themselves. But to understand that night, to understand how a man like Stanley Kowalski could do what he did, we have to go back. Back to the winter of 1979. Back to a city that was dying. Back to a picket line where everything Stanley Kowalski believed in was being torn apart, one scab at a time. To understand Pittsburgh in 1979, you have to understand what steel meant to that city. Steel was not an industry. Steel was religion. Steel was identity. Steel was the reason your grandfather left Krakow with nothing but a cloth bag and a name that immigration officers could not spell. Steel was the reason your father bought a house in Polish Hill instead of dying in a coal mine. Steel was the reason you could feed your children, bury your parents, and hold your head up when you walked into church on Sunday morning. By the autumn of 1979, that religion was dying. The Monongahela Valley stretched southeast from Pittsburgh like a wounded animal, 15 miles of smokestacks and blast furnaces. Towns with names like Homestead, Braddock, McKeesport, and Duquesne. Towns that existed for one reason and one reason only: to make steel. At its peak, the valley employed over 90,000 men. 90,000 fathers who woke before dawn, packed tin lunches, and walked through gates that led to the hottest, loudest, most dangerous work in America. They poured iron at 2,800 degrees. They breathed air thick with sulfur and coal dust. They watched friends lose fingers, hands, and lives to machines that never stopped moving, and they did it proudly. Because a steelworker in Pittsburgh made $12 an hour in 1979. A steelworker owned his home. A steelworker sent his sons to trade school and his daughters to nursing college. A steelworker was somebody. But by November of that year, the valley had already lost 18,000 jobs. Jones and Laughlin had announced layoffs in August. United States Steel was talking about closing 3 plants before Christmas. The Homestead Works, which had once employed 15,000 men, was operating at 40% capacity with a skeleton crew. The official unemployment rate in Allegheny County was 11%. But in the steel neighborhoods, in places like Polish Hill and Lawrenceville and the South Side, the real number was closer to 20. 1 in 5 men was out of work. 1 in 5 families was surviving on savings that were running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. The Mon Valley in autumn smelled like fear. If you stood on the hillside above Braddock and looked down at the river, you could see it. Smokestacks that should have been belching fire stood cold and silent. Parking lots that should have been full at shift change held a dozen cars instead of 1,000. The orange glow that had lit up the night sky for 70 years, the glow that steelworkers called the heartbeat of the city, was fading. And in its place came something else. The smell of desperation, the sound of men arguing at kitchen tables about bills they could not pay, the sight of for sale signs appearing on houses that had been in the same family for 3 generations. The Monongahela Valley Steel Works sat on the river between Homestead and Duquesne. It was not the largest mill in the valley, but it was one of the oldest. Built in 1908 by a consortium of Polish and Slovak investors who wanted a mill where their countrymen could work without answering to Irish foremen or German supervisors. By 1979, the mill employed 2,200 men. Most of them were 2nd, 3rd, or 4th generation. Sons who had followed fathers who had followed grandfathers through those same gates. Families with names like Kowalski, Nowak, Wisniewski, and Stanchak. Names that had been on the payroll since before the First World War. The mill ran 3 shifts, 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, 2 until 10 at night, 10 until 6 the next morning, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The furnaces never went cold, could never go cold, because relighting a blast furnace cost more money than most men would earn in a lifetime. The work was brutal. Open hearth men worked in temperatures that reached 130 degrees in summer. They wore asbestos suits and leather aprons. They watched molten steel pour like water from ladles the size of small houses. One splash, one stumble, one moment of lost concentration, and a man could disappear. Burned so completely that there would be nothing left to bury. Older workers told stories about the men who had died in those furnaces, about the ones who fell into the ladles and were found only when the steel was poured and something was wrong with the color, about the ones who were standing too close when a furnace wall gave way, about the ones who breathed too much gas and simply collapsed where they stood, dead before they hit the ground. The mill took fingers, it took hands, it took eyes and ears and lungs, and the men who worked there accepted this, because the mill also gave. It gave wages that let a man with an 8th grade education live like a professional. It gave pensions that meant his widow would never have to work. It gave dignity. In Pittsburgh, a steelworker was not a laborer. A steelworker was a craftsman. A steelworker was a man who had mastered fire itself. The Union Hall for Local 1397 of the United Steelworkers of America stood 3 blocks from the mill gates. A brick building with a Polish eagle painted above the door and a flagpole out front that flew the American flag, the Pennsylvania flag, and the Union banner. Every man who worked at Monongahela Valley Steel was a member of Local 1397. Dues were $14 a month, deducted automatically from paychecks. In return, the union negotiated wages, benefits, and working conditions. The union filed grievances when foremen treated men unfairly. The union made sure that when a man was injured, his family was taken care of. But by 1979, the union was not what it had been. In 1973, the international leadership of the United Steelworkers had signed something called the Experimental Negotiating Agreement, the ENA. In exchange for guaranteed wage increases and job security provisions, the union had surrendered the right to conduct industry-wide strikes. The rank and file had not been consulted. The rank and file had not voted. The men who actually worked the furnaces learned about the ENA the same way they learned about everything else, from a notice posted on the Union Hall bulletin board. Some men accepted it. The ENA meant peace. The ENA meant predictable wages. The ENA meant no more walking picket lines in January while your children asked why there was no heat. Other men never forgave it, because the ENA meant something else too. It meant the union had traded away its only real weapon, the strike. The ability to shut down production and force the companies to negotiate. Stanley Kowalski was one of the men who never forgave. He had been shop steward for Furnace Building 4 since 1968, elected by the men he worked with, trusted to represent their interests when supervisors pushed too hard or safety conditions got too dangerous. Stanley took that trust seriously. He filed more grievances than any other steward in Local 1397. He argued with foremen until they stopped arguing back. He made sure his men went home with the same number of fingers they had arrived with. But in September of 1979, Stanley Kowalski and the men of Furnace Building 4 did something that the union leadership had forbidden. They went on strike. The wildcat started over a termination. A man named Walter Jankowski, 54 years old, 31 years at the mill, had been fired for refusing to work overtime on a Sunday. His daughter was being married that afternoon. Walter had requested the day off 3 weeks in advance. The request had been denied. Walter had gone to the wedding anyway. On Monday morning, Walter found his locker cleaned out and his name removed from the schedule. Stanley Kowalski called a meeting that night. 47 men crowded into his basement on Dobson Street in Polish Hill. They voted unanimously to walk out until Walter was reinstated. The International Union refused to sanction the strike. Local 1397 leadership refused to provide strike funds. The company announced that any man who did not report for his next scheduled shift would be considered to have voluntarily resigned. 47 men walked out anyway, and that was when the scabs arrived. Stanley Kowalski was not a large man, 5 feet 10 inches, 180 pounds. But he carried himself like someone who had never been afraid of anything in his life. His hands told his story better than words ever could. Thick fingers, calluses layered on calluses. A scar across the left palm where molten slag had splashed through a torn glove in 1961. 2 fingernails on the right hand that had grown back black after being crushed beneath a steel plate. These were not the hands of a man who gave orders from behind a desk. These were the hands of a man who had earned every dollar he had ever made. His face was weathered in the way that steelworkers' faces became weathered. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting into furnace light. A nose that had been broken twice, once in a bar fight in 1952 and once when a chain snapped and whipped across his face in 1967. His hair had gone grey at the temples by 40 and had surrendered completely to white by 50. He kept it short, military short, the same cut he had worn since Korea. Korea. That was where Stanley Kowalski had learned what he was capable of. He had enlisted in 1951, 3 months after his father died in the mill. 17 years old. Too young to drink, too young to vote, old enough to carry a rifle up a frozen hillside while Chinese soldiers tried to kill him. He served with the 2nd Infantry Division, fought at Heartbreak Ridge, earned a Purple Heart when shrapnel from a mortar round tore through his left thigh. Spent 6 weeks in a field hospital in Japan, then went back to the line because his friends were still there and Stanley Kowalski did not abandon his friends. He came home in 1953 with a limp that still bothered him in cold weather, a bronze star that he kept in a drawer and never discussed, and an understanding of violence that most men never acquire. Stanley knew what it meant to take a life. He knew what it felt like to watch a man die. He knew that killing was not difficult. Living with it afterward was the hard part. He went back to the mill 2 weeks after his discharge, walked through the same gates his father had walked through, reported to the same furnace building where his father had worked, told the foreman he was Michael Kowalski's son and he was ready to learn. For 31 years, Stanley Kowalski had learned. He started as a 3rd helper, the lowest position on the furnace crew, fetching tools, cleaning slag, watching the experienced men and trying to understand what they understood. He moved up to 2nd helper after 2 years, then 1st helper after 5. By 1963, he was a melter, one of the men who actually controlled the furnace, who decided when the steel was ready to pour. It was skilled work, dangerous work. A melter watched the color of the flames, the movement of the metal, the readings on gauges that measured things most people did not know existed. A good melter could save the company thousands of dollars by timing the pour perfectly. A bad melter could kill everyone in the building. Stanley was a good melter. The best in Furnace Building 4, according to men who had been doing this work since before he was born. He had an instinct for the steel. He could look at a heat and know, without checking the instruments, whether it was ready. He could hear when something was wrong, when a seal was failing or a valve was sticking, before the alarms even triggered. The company had offered him foreman positions 3 times. 3 times he had refused, because foreman did not work the furnace. Foreman walked around with clipboards and told other men what to do. Stanley Kowalski did not want to tell other men what to do. He wanted to make steel. It was the only thing he had ever wanted. His wife Helena had understood this from the beginning. They met in 1954 at a dance at the Polish National Alliance Hall on the south side. Helena Massacre, 20 years old, black hair and green eyes, and a laugh that made Stanley forget how to speak. She was working as a seamstress at a dress factory downtown. Her father had been a miner in Scranton before the coal gave out and the family moved west looking for work. Stanley asked her to dance. She said yes. He stepped on her feet 3 times in 4 minutes. She married him anyway, 29 years, 3 sons, a house on Dobson Street that they had bought in 1958 for $11,000 and never missed a payment on. Helena had made that house into something. Curtains she sewed herself, a garden in the tiny backyard where she grew tomatoes and peppers, a kitchen where the smell of pierogi and kielbasa and golabki meant that no matter how hard the shift had been, Stanley was home. She had aged the way steelworkers' wives aged. Worry lines that came from waiting for the phone call that might never come, the one that said there had been an accident. Grey in her hair that she stopped dyeing around the time the boys finished school. A thickness in her body that came from years of cooking for men who worked 12-hour shifts and came home starving. But her eyes were still the same, green and sharp and knowing. Helena saw everything. She saw when Stanley came home angry and needed to be left alone. She saw when he came home broken and needed to be held. She saw, that autumn of 1979, that something was building inside her husband. Something that frightened her more than she would ever admit. They had 3 sons, all of them steelworkers, all of them union men. Joseph was the oldest, 30 years old, born in 1949, the year Stanley came home from Korea. Joseph had done his own time in the service, 3 years in the army, 1968 to 1971. He had come back different, quieter, quicker to anger. He worked the blast furnace at the east end of the mill, a different building from his father, because Stanley had insisted. A man should make his own name. A man should not ride his father's reputation. Joseph was divorced. His wife had left in 1976, taken their daughter to Ohio, and Joseph had never recovered. He lived alone now in an apartment on Carson Street. He drank more than he should. He showed up for work and did his job and went home and sat in the dark. Stanley worried about Joseph, but Stanley did not know how to help him. Fathers and sons did not talk about such things, not in their world. Marek was the middle son, 27. The thoughtful one, Helena called him. Marek read books. Marek asked questions. Marek had finished 2 years at community college before deciding that school was not for him and following his father and brother into the mill. He worked as a crane operator, moving ladles of molten steel from the furnace to the casting area. It was precise work. Marek was good at precise work. He was married to a woman named Anna, a nurse at Mercy Hospital. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, 5 and 3. Marek brought them to Sunday dinner every week. Stanley would sit on the floor and play with his grandchildren while Helena pretended to scold him for spoiling them. Those Sunday dinners were the only time Stanley laughed anymore. Pavel was the youngest, 23. The baby, even though he stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. Pavel had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. He had been working the mill since he graduated high school, 5 years now, and he was still learning, still making mistakes, still asking questions that made the older men shake their heads and remember when they had been that young. Pavel was engaged to a girl named Maria. The wedding was planned for April of 1980. Helena was already sewing the dress, already planning the reception, already imagining grandchildren. Pavel was the one Stanley worried about most. Not because Pavel was weak, because Pavel was young, because Pavel had not yet learned that the world was not fair. Because Pavel still believed that if you worked hard and did the right thing, everything would turn out the way it was supposed to. Stanley had believed that once. Korea had beaten it out of him. The mill had finished the job. The men who crossed the picket line were not monsters. Stanley knew this. He told himself this every morning when he watched them walk through the gates while police officers kept the strikers back. He reminded himself that they were just men, desperate men, men with families and bills and fears of their own. Their leader was a man named Roy Tenner, 40 years old, from a town called Marmot in West Virginia, a coal town where the mines had closed 5 years earlier and nothing had replaced them. Roy had worked underground for 15 years before the layoffs. He had a wife and 4 children. He had lost his house in 1977. He had been living in his brother-in-law's basement for 2 years, picking up day labor when he could find it. When the recruiters came through Marmot looking for men willing to work in Pittsburgh, Roy Tenner had been first in line. The pay was $11 an hour, housing provided, transportation provided. All he had to do was walk through a gate while angry men shouted at him. Roy had done worse things for less money. He brought 10 men with him. Men he knew from the mines, men he trusted, men who were just as desperate as he was. They arrived in Pittsburgh on September 28, 1979, in a chartered bus with blacked-out windows. They were taken directly to the mill, where cots had been set up in an empty warehouse. They would live inside the fence for the duration, safer that way, for everyone. Roy Tenner was not a scab by choice, he was a scab by circumstance. The same economic collapse that was killing the steel mills in Pittsburgh had already killed the coal mines in West Virginia. Roy was simply following the work, the way working men had always followed the work, the way Stanley Kowalski's grandfather had followed the work from Krakow to Pittsburgh 70 years earlier. But Stanley Kowalski did not see Roy Tenner's desperation. Stanley Kowalski saw a stranger operating the furnace where his father had died. Stanley Kowalski saw an outsider earning wages that belonged to Walter Jankowski, to men who had given their lives to that mill. Stanley Kowalski saw a betrayal so profound that it burned in his chest like the furnace itself. And every morning when Stanley stood on that picket line and watched Roy Tenner walk through the gates, the burning got worse. The confrontation happened on October 15, 1979, 18 days into the wildcat strike. Stanley had been on the picket line since 5 in the morning. October in Pittsburgh meant temperatures in the low 40s before dawn, meant breath visible in the air, meant fingers going numb inside gloves that were not thick enough. The strikers kept warm by walking, back and forth along the fence line, carrying signs that said "Unfair and reinstate Jankowski and Local 1397 stands together." Except Local 1397 was not standing together. The International had made that clear. The local leadership had made that clear. This was an unauthorized action. These men were on their own. At 6:45, the bus arrived. The same bus that arrived every morning, blacked-out windows, police escort in front and behind. The strikers moved to block the gate, the way they did every morning. The police moved to push them back, the way they did every morning. But this morning was different. This morning, Roy Tenner stepped off the bus and walked directly toward the picket line. Walked directly toward Stanley Kowalski, who was standing at the center of the line with a sign in his hands. The police tensed. The strikers tensed. Everyone expected violence. Roy Tenner stopped 3 feet from Stanley and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I know who you are. You are Stanley Kowalski. Your father was Michael Kowalski. He died in Furnace 4 in 1952. Stanley said nothing. His hands tightened on the sign. I am sorry about your father, Roy Tenner said. I am sorry about your strike. I am sorry about all of this. But I have 4 children who need to eat. I have a wife who needs medicine. I have not worked steady in 2 years, so I am going to walk through that gate. And I am going to do the job they are paying me to do. And I am not going to apologize for it. Stanley found his voice. That job is not yours to do. Roy Tenner shook his head. It is now. That is how this works. You know that. Your grandfather took a job from somebody when he came here from Poland. Your father took a job from somebody. Now I am taking a job. That is what desperate men do. We take what we can get. Stanley stepped closer. Close enough to smell the coffee on Roy Tenner's breath. Close enough to see the grey in his stubble and the exhaustion in his eyes. My grandfather built that furnace. My father died in that furnace. I have worked that furnace for 31 years. And you think you can walk in here and take it from me because you need the money? Roy Tenner did not step back. I think I can walk in here and take it from you because you walked out. You made a choice. You chose your pride over your paycheck. I do not have that luxury. I have not had that luxury for a long time. The police were moving now, positioning themselves between the 2 men. A sergeant was shouting for everyone to calm down. Stanley spoke quietly. Quietly enough that only Roy Tenner could hear. You are going to regret this. Roy Tenner held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked through the gate. The other scabs followed him. The police held the line until the bus was inside and the gate was closed. Stanley stood there for a long time after. The other strikers tried to talk to him. He did not respond. He was watching the gate, watching the place where Roy Tenner had disappeared. That night, Stanley Kowalski stopped sleeping. The system failure began before the strike. It had been failing for years, but Stanley had not seen it clearly until he needed the system to work and discovered that it was not there. The first call was to the union. October 3rd. Stanley called the regional office of the United Steel Workers and asked for support. He explained the situation. Walter Jankowski, 31 years, fired for attending his daughter's wedding. The wildcat strike. 47 men standing together. The regional representative listened politely. Then he explained that unauthorized work stoppages were a violation of the experimental negotiating agreement. The International could not provide strike funds. The International could not sanction the action. The International recommended that the men return to work immediately and file a grievance through proper channels. Stanley asked what would happen to Walter Jankowski if they went back. The representative said that was between Walter and the company. The union could not help a man who had been terminated for cause. Stanley hung up the phone and did not call the regional office again. The second call was to a lawyer. October 5th. Stanley found a labor attorney in downtown Pittsburgh who agreed to meet with him. The attorney listened to the story, reviewed the termination paperwork, shook his head. The company followed procedure, the attorney said. Walter was warned. Walter refused a direct order. The termination is legal. You could file a lawsuit, but it would take 2 years and cost $30,000, and you would probably lose. Stanley asked about the scabs. Was it legal to bring in replacement workers during a wildcat strike? The attorney almost laughed. Legal? It is standard practice. The company has every right to maintain operations. The police have every obligation to protect those workers. You have the right to stand on public property and hold a sign. That is the extent of your rights. Stanley left the attorney's office and did not go back. The third call was to the police. October 9th. A striker named Thomas Wojcik had been beaten the night before. 3 men in a car with no plates had pulled up beside him as he walked home from the picket line. They had dragged him into an alley and worked him over with pipes, broken his arm, cracked 2 ribs, told him that if he showed up on the picket line again, they would finish the job. Stanley called the police station and reported the assault. A detective came to the hospital, took Thomas's statement, and promised to investigate. A week later, Stanley called to ask about the investigation. The detective said there were no leads, no witnesses, no plate numbers, nothing to go on. Stanley asked if the detective had questioned anyone at the company. The detective said that was not how investigations worked. The fourth call was to the mayor's office, October 11th. Stanley had voted for Richard Calaguiri, had knocked on doors for him, had believed him when he said he was a friend to working families. A secretary took Stanley's information and promised someone would call back. No one called back. Stanley called again the next day and the next. On the fourth day, an assistant to the mayor informed Stanley that the city could not intervene in private labor disputes. The assistant wished Stanley luck and hung up. The fifth call was to the newspaper. October 12th. Stanley talked to a reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette who seemed interested in the story, seemed sympathetic, promised to look into it. The story ran 3 days later. On page 14, 4 paragraphs. The headline was "Wildcat Strike Continues at Mon Valley Mill." The article mentioned that the strike was unauthorized, that the company had hired replacement workers, that the union had declined to comment. It did not mention Walter Jankowski. It did not mention the beating of Thomas Wojcik. It did not mention that 47 families were slowly starving because they had stood up for a friend. Stanley cut the article out of the newspaper and pinned it to the wall in his basement. He stared at it for a long time. By October 15th, the day of the confrontation with Roy Tenner, Stanley Kowalski had made 14 phone calls seeking help. 14 calls to unions, lawyers, police, politicians, and journalists. 14 calls that had produced nothing. No help was coming. The system that was supposed to protect working men had abandoned them, had abandoned Walter Jankowski, had abandoned the 47 men who had walked out in solidarity, had abandoned everything Stanley Kowalski had believed in since he was 17 years old. That night, after the confrontation at the gate, Stanley went home and sat at the kitchen table. Helena brought him dinner. He did not touch it. She asked him what was wrong. He did not answer. She asked him what he was going to do. He did not answer. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him, and then she went to bed alone. Stanley sat at that table until 3 in the morning, thinking, planning, remembering. He remembered his father's funeral, the closed casket because there was nothing left to look at, the priest saying that Michael Kowalski had died doing honest work, that God welcomed honest workers into his kingdom. Stanley had been 17. He had not cried. He had simply stared at the casket and made a decision. He would go into the mill. He would work where his father had worked. He would make his father proud. He remembered Korea, the frozen hillside, the Chinese soldiers coming in waves, the moment when he realized that no one was coming to save them, that they would have to save themselves or die where they stood. He had saved himself. He had done things that still visited him in dreams. But he had survived. He remembered the men who had walked out with him, 47 men, men with families, men with mortgages, men who had trusted Stanley Kowalski when he said that standing together was the right thing to do. Those men were running out of money, running out of hope, running out of faith that any of this would make a difference. And he remembered Roy Tenner's face, the certainty in it, the resignation, the absolute confidence that he would walk through that gate tomorrow and the next day and the day after that until the strikers gave up and went away. "You are going to regret this." Stanley had meant it when he said it, but he had not known what he meant, not yet. The decision came 3 days later, October 18th, 1979, a Saturday. Helena was at church for a women's auxiliary meeting. The house was empty. Stanley called his sons, one by one. Joseph first, then Marek, then Pavel. He asked them to come to the house. He asked them not to tell their mother. They arrived within an hour. They sat around the kitchen table, The same table where Stanley had eaten breakfast with his father 40 years ago. The same table where he had proposed to Helena. The same table where he had told his sons that they were going to have a baby sister who was never born because God had other plans. Stanley looked at his sons, at Joseph, who was broken in ways that might never heal, at Marek, who had a wife and children and everything to lose, at Pavel, who was young enough to still believe in fairness. He told them what he was thinking. He told them that the strike was failing, that men were starting to talk about going back, that within a month, maybe 2, the picket line would collapse and the scabs would become permanent, and Walter Jankowski would be forgotten, and everything they had fought for would mean nothing. He told them about the 14 phone calls, about the union that had abandoned them, about the lawyer who had shrugged, about the police who did not care, about the mayor who would not return calls, about the newspaper that buried the story on page 14. He told them that he had been thinking about Korea, about what he had learned there, about what a man does when the system fails and no one is coming to help and the enemy is right there in front of you. He told them about Furnace 4, about the emergency exits that locked from the outside, about the ventilation system that could be shut down with a single switch, about the temperature inside that building when the furnace was running at full capacity. He told them what he wanted to do. When he finished, no one spoke. Joseph stared at the table. Marek stared at his hands. Pavel stared at his father. Finally, Joseph spoke. When? Stanley had not expected that. He had expected arguments, objections. He had expected his sons to tell him he was crazy, that this was wrong, that they could not be part of something like this. Instead, Joseph had asked when. November, Stanley said. After the election. After the weather turns cold. When the scabs are settled and comfortable and not expecting anything. Marek spoke next. All of them? All 11? Stanley nodded. All of them. If we leave witnesses, we are finished. Pavel had not spoken yet. He was still staring at his father. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Stanley looked at his youngest son. You do not have to be part of this. None of you do. But if you are in all the way. No hesitation, no mercy. Because once we do this, there is no going back. We become something else, something we cannot undo. Pavel swallowed hard. Maria, he said. The wedding. Stanley nodded. I know. Pavel closed his eyes, opened them. What would grandfather have done? Stanley thought about his father, about the man who had come to America with nothing and built a life through work that would have killed most men, about the man who had told Stanley when he was very young that a Kowalski does not run from a fight. A Kowalski does not let others take what is his. A Kowalski stands up, even when standing up means standing alone. Your grandfather would have done exactly what I am going to do. Pavel nodded slowly. Then I am in. Marek looked at his brother, then at his father, then at Joseph. He thought about Anna, about his children, about the life he had built, and then he thought about the men who had walked out with them, about Walter Jankowski, about what it meant to abandon your friends when they needed you most. I am in. Joseph did not hesitate. He had been in since the moment Stanley started talking. He had nothing left to lose, nothing except his father and his brothers, and he would not lose them by walking away. I am in. Stanley looked at his sons. 3 men, his blood, his legacy. Together, they were going to do something terrible, something that could not be forgiven, something that would change their family forever. He should have felt horror. He should have felt doubt. He should have felt something other than the cold, clear certainty that had settled over him like a familiar coat. Instead, he felt ready. From this night on, Stanley said, we do not speak of this outside this room. We do not write anything down. We do not tell anyone. Not your mother, not your wives, no one. When the time comes, I will tell you what to do. Until then, we wait, we watch, we plan. His sons nodded. Stanley stood up. He walked to the cabinet above the refrigerator. He took down a bottle of whiskey that had been there since Joseph came home from Vietnam. He poured 4 glasses. They drank in silence. And in that silence, something ended. The part of Stanley Kowalski that had believed in unions and laws and the goodness of the system. The part that had trusted other men to do the right thing. The part that had hoped, despite everything, that this would work out the way it was supposed to. That part was gone now. What remained was older, harder. The part that had survived Korea. The part that had learned on a frozen hillside 30 years ago that when no one is coming to save you, you save yourself, whatever the cost. The planning took 3 weeks. Stanley approached it the way he had approached everything in his life, methodically, carefully, without emotion. He had learned in Korea that emotion got men killed. Emotion made you hesitate when you should act. Emotion made you act when you should wait. The men who survived were the ones who could set their feelings aside and think clearly about what needed to be done. The first problem was information. Stanley needed to know exactly where the scabs would be on the night he chose, what time they finished their shift, where they went afterward, whether they stayed together or separated, whether anyone else would be in the building with them. He started watching. Every evening after the picket line disbanded, Stanley would find a spot on the hillside above the mill, a place where he could see the gates, the buildings, the parking areas. He brought binoculars that he had bought at a pawn shop on Carson Street. He brought a notebook from the drugstore, the kind with the cardboard cover that cost 89 cents. He watched for patterns. The scabs worked the night shift. 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. They entered through the main gate at 9:45, escorted by security guards. They walked together to Furnace Building 4. They did not leave the building during their shift, except for breaks, which they took in a small room attached to the main structure. At 6 in the morning, when the day shift arrived, the scabs walked back to the warehouse where they lived. They ate breakfast in a makeshift cafeteria. They slept until mid-afternoon. Then they ate again, watched television in a common room, and prepared for the next shift. They never left the mill grounds. Not once in 3 weeks of watching. The fence kept them in as much as it kept the strikers out. Stanley wrote everything down. Times, locations, numbers. He noted which security guards worked which nights. He noted when the supervisors made their rounds. He noted that between 2 and 4 in the morning, the activity in Furnace Building 4 was at its lowest. The steel had been poured. The furnace was being recharged. The scabs were waiting for the next heat. That was when they would be most vulnerable. That was when they would be together in one place, with nothing to do but wait. The second problem was access. Stanley had worked at the Monongahela Valley Steel Works for 31 years. He knew every building, every gate, every tunnel and passage and forgotten corner of that complex. He knew things that the security guards did not know. Things that the supervisors had forgotten. Things that only the old-timers remembered. There was a drainage culvert on the east side of the property. It ran beneath the fence and emerged near the coal storage area. The grate that covered the millside opening had been broken since 1968. Stanley had reported it once. Nothing had been done. He had not reported it again. A man could fit through that culvert. 4 men could fit through that culvert if they went one at a time and did not mind getting wet. The third problem was the furnace building itself. Furnace Building 4 had 3 exits. The main entrance faced the yard. A side door led to the break room. An emergency exit at the rear opened onto a loading dock that was no longer used. All 3 doors could be locked from the outside. Stanley knew this because he had locked them himself, years ago, during a safety drill that no one remembered anymore. The locks were simple. Heavy bolts that slid into brackets mounted on the frame. A man with a wrench could secure those doors in 30 seconds. The ventilation system was controlled from a panel in the maintenance corridor. Stanley had helped install that panel in 1971. He knew exactly which switches controlled the airflow to the furnace floor. He knew exactly what would happen if those switches were turned off. The fourth problem was weapons. Stanley did not intend to use guns. Guns were loud. Guns left evidence. Guns could be traced. More importantly, guns were not necessary. The furnace would do the work. All Stanley and his sons needed to do was make sure the scabs could not escape, but they would need something, a backup, a way to handle anyone who was not where they were supposed to be, a way to deal with the unexpected. Joseph had a hunting knife, 8-inch blade, sharp enough to shave with. He had carried it in Vietnam and brought it home with him. He had not used it since. Marek had a length of steel pipe, 2 feet long, heavy enough to crack a skull with one swing. He kept it in his truck for emergencies that had never come. Powell had nothing. Stanley gave him a tire iron from the garage, told him to keep it close, told him to practice swinging it until it felt natural in his hand. Stanley had his hands, the same hands that had poured steel for 31 years, the same hands that had killed men in Korea. They would be enough. The fifth problem was timing. Stanley chose November 13th, a Tuesday. The weather forecast called for fog and temperatures in the mid-20s, cold enough to keep people indoors, dark enough to hide movement, miserable enough that anyone with a choice would stay home. The fog was important. Stanley remembered fog from Korea, the way it swallowed sound, the way it turned the world into a grey nothing where a man could move without being seen, the way it made everything feel unreal, like a dream you could not wake from. November 13th, between 2 and 4 in the morning. The drainage culvert, the back door, the ventilation panel, the locks. Stanley wrote nothing down. He memorized everything. Then he told his sons. The meeting happened on November 8th, 5 days before. At Stanley's house, in the basement, with the door locked and the radio playing loud enough to cover their voices. Stanley laid out the plan. Every detail, every contingency, every way that something could go wrong and what they would do if it did. Joseph would handle the main entrance. He would approach from the coal storage area, cross the yard during the shift change, and position himself near the door. When Stanley gave the signal, Joseph would slide the bolt and move to the side door. Marek would handle the ventilation. He would enter through the drainage culvert first, make his way to the maintenance corridor, and wait at the panel. When Stanley gave the signal, Marek would cut the airflow and then move to secure the emergency exit. Pavel would stay with Stanley. They would enter the culvert last, make their way to the break room, and ensure that no one escaped through the side door. If any of the scabs were in the break room when the doors were locked, Stanley and Pavel would deal with them. Once all 3 exits were secured, they would wait. The furnace would do the rest. The heat inside that building would rise quickly once the ventilation was cut. The men inside would realize something was wrong within minutes. They would try the doors. They would find them locked. They would try to break the windows. But the windows in Furnace Building 4 were reinforced glass, designed to withstand explosions. They would not break easily. By the time anyone did break through, if anyone did, the smoke would have done its work. Stanley estimated 30 minutes, maybe less. The furnace was running at full capacity during the night shift. The temperature on the floor was already over 100 degrees. Without ventilation, without any way to escape the heat, the men inside would not last long. His sons listened in silence. When Stanley finished, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, Marek asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the planning began. What about the families? Stanley looked at his middle son, the one with children of his own, the one who understood, better than Joseph or Pavel, what it meant to leave a family without a father. Their families are not our concern, Stanley said. Those men made a choice. They chose to cross a picket line. They chose to take jobs that belonged to other men. They chose their families over ours. Now we are choosing ours over theirs. Marek did not look satisfied, but he did not argue. Pavel spoke next. What if someone sees us? What if something goes wrong? If something goes wrong, we scatter. We go home. We never speak of this again. If one of us is caught, he says nothing. He takes the blame alone. He protects the others. Stanley looked at each of his sons in turn. This is not negotiable. If you are caught, you do not talk. You do not make deals. You do not trade your family for a lighter sentence. You go to prison and you keep your mouth shut. That is the price of being a Kowalski. Can you pay it?" Joseph nodded immediately. He had already decided that his life was worth nothing. Prison would be no different from the apartment on Carson Street. At least in prison, he would have done something that mattered. Marek hesitated. He thought about Anna, about his children, about the life he had built. Then he thought about what kind of man he would be if he abandoned his father and brothers now. What kind of father? What kind of example? "I can pay it." Pavel was the last. His face was pale, his hands were trembling. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I can pay it." Stanley allowed himself a moment of pride. His sons were good men, strong men. They would do what needed to be done, and they would live with the consequences. That was all a father could ask. The meeting ended. They went home to their lives. For 5 more days they pretended that everything was normal. The night before, Stanley could not sleep. He lay in bed beside Helena, listening to her breathe, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. The clock on the nightstand said 2:17. In 24 hours it would be over, one way or another. He thought about his father, about the last conversation they had ever had. It was the morning before the accident. Stanley had been 17, still angry at the world, still convinced that he knew better than everyone else. His father had said something to him, something that Stanley had dismissed at the time and had thought about every day since. A man is not what he says. A man is not what he believes. A man is what he does. When the time comes, when everything you believe is tested, what you do is who you are. For 31 years, Stanley had done the right thing. He had worked hard. He had provided for his family. He had followed the rules, paid his taxes, voted in every election, gone to church on Sunday. He had believed that if he did all of this, the world would treat him fairly. The world had not treated him fairly. The world had taken his job, his dignity, his faith in the system that was supposed to protect men like him. The world had sent strangers to operate the furnace where his father had died. Now the time had come. Now everything Stanley believed was being tested. And what he was going to do would define who he was for the rest of his life. He did not feel doubt. He had expected to feel doubt, had braced himself for it, but it never came. What he felt instead was a cold clarity, a certainty that went deeper than thought. Those men had to pay, not because Stanley hated them. He did not hate them. He understood them. He understood that they were desperate, that they were doing what desperate men did. But understanding was not forgiveness. Understanding did not change what they had done. Understanding did not bring back Walter Jankowski's job or heal the wounds they had inflicted on 47 families. Someone had to answer for that. The company would not answer. The union would not answer. The police, the politicians, the lawyers, the newspapers, none of them would answer. They had all looked the other way. They had all decided that the suffering of working men was not their problem. So Stanley would make it their problem. He would make it everyone's problem. He would do something so terrible that no one could look away. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a company tried to break a strike, the next time scabs tried to cross a picket line, someone would remember what happened at the Monongahela Valley Steel Works. Someone would hesitate. That was the only justice Stanley could give to Walter Jankowski, the only justice he could give to his father, the only justice available to men like him. He got out of bed at 3 in the morning. He went downstairs to the kitchen. He made coffee and sat at the table, the same table where he had told his sons what they were going to do. Helena found him there an hour later. She stood in the doorway in her bathrobe, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft with sleep. "You have not come back to bed." Stanley shook his head. She crossed to the table and sat across from him. She did not ask what was wrong. She had stopped asking weeks ago. She knew he would not answer. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm. Her touch was gentle. After 29 years, she still knew exactly what he needed without being told. "Whatever happens," she said, "I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you." Stanley looked at his wife, at the woman who had given him everything good in his life, at the woman who deserved so much better than what was coming. "I love you too." They sat there in silence, holding hands across the table until the sun came up. The last normal day began at 7 in the morning. Stanley went to Mass at Immaculate Heart of Mary. He had not missed a Sunday Mass in 40 years, but this was Tuesday, and he went anyway. He sat in the back pew and listened to Father Wojciechowski say the words he had heard 1,000 times. He did not pray. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply sat in the quiet and let the peace of that place wash over him one last time. After Mass, he went to breakfast at the diner on Dobson Street. He ordered eggs and bacon and toast, the same breakfast he had ordered every Tuesday for 20 years. The waitress knew his name. She asked about Helena, about the boys, about the strike. Stanley answered politely. He left a $5 tip on a $3 check. He spent the afternoon in his garage, working on an old radio that had stopped working months ago. It was pointless work. He would never finish repairing that radio, but it gave his hands something to do while his mind went over the plan one final time. At 4 o'clock, Helena called him in for dinner. She had made his favorite: kielbasa and sauerkraut and mashed potatoes, the food his mother used to make, the food that meant home. They ate together at the kitchen table. They talked about ordinary things: the weather, the neighbors, the price of heating oil. They did not talk about the strike. They did not talk about what Stanley was doing that night. After dinner, Stanley helped Helena wash the dishes. He dried each plate carefully, the way she had taught him when they were first married and he had not known how to do anything domestic. He stacked them in the cabinet. He folded the dish towel and hung it on the hook by the sink. Then he kissed his wife. Not a quick kiss. Not the automatic kiss of long marriage. A real kiss. The kind of kiss he had given her on their wedding night. The kind of kiss that said everything words could not say. Helena looked at him when he pulled away. Her eyes were wet. "Stanley," she said. Her voice broke on his name. He put his finger to her lips. "Do not ask. Please, just let me go." She closed her eyes. A tear ran down her cheek. She nodded. Stanley went upstairs. He showered. He shaved. He put on clean clothes, dark pants, dark sweater, work boots with rubber soles, nothing that would reflect light, nothing that would make noise. He came back downstairs at 9 o'clock. Helena was sitting in the living room, in the chair by the window, staring at nothing. She did not turn when he entered. Stanley stood in the doorway for a long moment, memorizing her, the curve of her shoulders, the grey in her hair, the way the lamplight caught the side of her face. "I will be home before morning," he said. She did not respond. He walked to her chair. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. He whispered something in Polish, the same words his father had whispered to his mother every night before bed, words that meant more than love, words that meant forever. Then he walked out the front door. Joseph was waiting in the truck at the end of the block. Marek and Pavel were in the back seat. No one spoke as Stanley climbed in. Joseph put the truck in gear. They drove toward the mill. November 13th, 1979, 11:47 p.m. The fog was everything Stanley had hoped for, thick as wool, cold as death. It rolled off the Monongahela River in waves, swallowing the streetlights, muffling sound, turning the world into a grey nothing where shapes appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Joseph parked the truck on a dead-end street half a mile from the mill, a street where no one lived anymore, where the houses had been abandoned when the layoffs started and the families moved away looking for work that did not exist. The four men sat in silence for a moment, breathing, listening, preparing. Stanley checked his watch. 3 hours until the shift change. 3 hours to get in, do what they came to do, and get out. He looked at his sons. Joseph's face was stone. Marek was pale but steady. Pavel was gripping the tire iron so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Remember the plan," Stanley said. "No talking once we go over the fence, hand signals only. If something goes wrong, we scatter. We meet back here in 1 hour. If someone does not show, we leave without them." His sons nodded. Stanley opened his door. The cold hit him like a fist. 23 degrees. His breath fogged in front of his face. They moved. The drainage culvert was exactly where Stanley remembered. A concrete pipe, 4 feet in diameter, running beneath the fence and emerging in a ditch near the coal storage area. The grate on the outside was rusted but intact. The grate on the inside was still broken, just as it had been for 11 years. Marek went first. He was the smallest of the 4, the one who would have the easiest time fitting through. He dropped to his knees, crawled into the darkness, and disappeared. Pavel went second, then Joseph, then Stanley, bringing up the rear. The culvert was wet, an inch of freezing water at the bottom, runoff from the recent rains. Stanley felt it soaking through his pants, numbing his knees, but he did not slow down. He crawled forward, following the sound of his sons ahead of him, until he saw the dim light at the far end. They emerged one by one into the ditch on the mill side of the fence. The coal storage area loomed above them, mountains of black rock, waiting to be fed into the furnaces. The smell of sulfur was overwhelming. Stanley checked his watch. 12:03 a.m. They moved along the edge of the coal piles, staying low, using the fog as cover. The mill was quiet at this hour. The day shift had gone home. The night shift was inside the buildings, working the furnaces, unaware that 4 men were creeping through the darkness toward them. Furnace Building 4 stood at the center of the complex. A massive structure of brick and steel, 200 feet long and 60 feet high. Smoke rose from vents in the roof, mixing with the fog until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. The orange glow of the furnace flickered through the windows. Even from outside, Stanley could feel the heat radiating off the walls. That building was alive, breathing, waiting. They reached the maintenance corridor at 12:17 a.m. This was the critical moment. The corridor connected the main mill to the furnace buildings. It was supposed to be locked at night, but Stanley knew that the lock had been broken since 1974 and no one had bothered to fix it. He had reported it once. Nothing had been done. He had not reported it again. The door opened with a soft click. Marek slipped inside. The others followed. The corridor was dark, emergency lighting only. Red bulbs every 20 feet, casting pools of crimson that made everything look like a photograph from a nightmare. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits. Steam hissed somewhere in the distance. They moved in single file, Stanley in front, Marek behind him, Pavel and Joseph bringing up the rear. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, no matter how carefully they walked. The ventilation panel was exactly where Stanley remembered. A metal box mounted on the wall, 3 feet square, with a dozen switches and gauges behind a hinged cover. Stanley had helped install this panel 8 years ago. He knew exactly which switches controlled the airflow to Furnace Building 4. He pointed at the panel. Marek nodded. This was his position. When Stanley gave the signal, Marek would cut the ventilation and then move to secure the emergency exit. Stanley pointed down the corridor toward the door that led to the furnace floor. Marek nodded again. He understood. The 3 remaining men continued down the corridor. The door to Furnace Building 4 was unlocked. It was always unlocked during shifts for safety reasons. A man needed to be able to get out quickly if something went wrong. If there was a spill, if there was an explosion, if the furnace decided to kill someone. Tonight, that door would work against the men inside. Stanley eased it open. Heat washed over him. 110 degrees on the furnace floor, even in November. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of molten metal. The roar of the furnace was deafening, a constant thunder that shook the walls and made the floor vibrate beneath his feet. He looked out onto the floor. The furnace dominated the space. A massive cylinder of brick and steel, 40 feet high, glowing orange at the seams where the heat leaked through. Ladles the size of small houses hung from overhead cranes, waiting to receive the molten steel. Catwalks crisscrossed above the floor, connecting control stations and observation platforms. And there, clustered near the break room door, were the scabs. Stanley counted them. 11 men, all present. They were taking a break between heats, drinking coffee from paper cups, talking in small groups. One of them was reading a newspaper. Another was smoking a cigarette near the ventilation intake. Roy Tenner was standing apart from the others, leaning against a support beam, staring at the furnace with an expression that Stanley recognized. The expression of a man who was good at his work and knew it. The expression of a man who had found purpose in a place that was not his. Stanley felt something twist in his chest, something that might have been regret in another life. He pushed it down. There was no room for regret now. He signaled to Joseph, the main entrance. Go. Joseph slipped away into the shadows, moving along the wall toward the front of the building. He would circle around the outside, approach the main door from the yard, and wait for Stanley's signal. Stanley signaled to Powell. Stay close. They moved along the edge of the furnace floor, keeping to the shadows, using the noise of the machinery to cover their footsteps. The break room door was 30 feet away, 20 feet, 10. Stanley checked his watch. 12:31 a.m. He held up his hand. Wait. Through the window of the break room, he could see 2 more figures, security guards, drinking coffee, playing cards at a folding table. They were supposed to be on patrol, but they had gotten lazy, comfortable, convinced that nothing would ever happen on the night shift. This was a problem. The security guards were not scabs. They were regular employees. Men who had worked at the mill for years. Men who had families. Men who had done nothing wrong except take a job that put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stanley had not planned for this. Pavel saw the guards too. He looked at his father with wide eyes. A question. What do we do? Stanley thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Those guards had chosen to protect the scabs. They had chosen to stand between the strikers and their jobs. They had chosen a side, and it was not the side of the men who had built this mill with their sweat and blood. Everyone inside dies, Stanley said. No exceptions. Pavel's face went pale, but he nodded. Stanley signaled. Now. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. Joseph reached the main entrance at 12:33 a.m. He found the bolt exactly where Stanley had said it would be. A heavy steel bar that slid into a bracket on the frame. It had not been used in years. The bracket was stiff with rust. Joseph put his weight into it and felt it give. The bolt slid home with a grinding screech that was swallowed by the roar of the furnace. The main entrance was sealed. Marek saw the signal from the maintenance corridor. A flash of light from Joseph's position. That meant the main door was secure. Marek reached for the ventilation panel. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. He had thought about this moment for 3 weeks. He had imagined it 1,000 times. Now it was real. He flipped the switches. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fans that pumped fresh air into Furnace Building 4 went silent. The fans that pulled smoke and fumes out of the building went silent. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. The furnace still roared. The heat still radiated from the walls. The men on the floor continued their break, unaware that the air they were breathing was about to become poison. Then Marek moved. He ran down the corridor, through a side passage, and emerged near the loading dock at the rear of the building. The emergency exit was there. A heavy steel door with a push bar on the inside and nothing on the outside. Marek found the bolt. He slid it home. The emergency exit was sealed. 12:35 a.m. Stanley and Powell moved at the same moment. The break room door was not locked. Why would it be? This was a functioning mill. Men moved in and out of that room 12 times per shift. No one had ever tried to lock it from the outside. Stanley hit the door at a run. The 2 security guards looked up from their card game, startled, confused. They saw a man they did not recognize, a man with murder in his eyes. The first guard reached for his radio. Stanley crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. His fist connected with the guard's temple. The guard went down hard, his head bouncing off the concrete floor. The second guard stood up, knocking over his chair. He was reaching for something on his belt, a flashlight, a baton. Stanley did not wait to find out. He grabbed the guard by the throat and drove him backward into the wall. The guard's head cracked against the brick. His eyes rolled back. He slid to the floor and did not move. Pavel stood in the doorway. His tire iron was in his hand. His face was the color of chalk. "The side door," Stanley said. "Now." Pavel did not move. Now. Pavel moved. The side door was 10 feet from the break room, a simple wooden door with a simple lock. Stanley had brought a padlock in his pocket. He had bought it at a hardware store in Greensburg, 20 miles away, paying cash. He had told the clerk he needed it for his garage. He snapped the padlock through the hasp. The side door was sealed. 12:37 a.m. 3 doors, all secured. 11 scabs and 2 unconscious guards inside a building with no ventilation and a furnace running at full capacity. Stanley stepped back onto the furnace floor. The scabs had noticed something was wrong. The air was already getting thicker. The smoke that usually vented through the roof was staying low, pooling near the floor, rising slowly toward the catwalks. One of the men was coughing. Another was looking around, confused. Roy Tenner was walking toward the main entrance, his brow furrowed. Stanley watched. Roy Tenner reached the main entrance. He pushed on the door. It did not move. He pushed harder. Nothing. He turned around. His eyes swept the furnace floor. They passed over the shadows where Stanley was standing without seeing him. Then they moved to the side door, to the emergency exit at the rear. "Try the other doors," Roy shouted over the roar of the furnace. Something is wrong. Men moved, running now. Fear spreading like fire through dry grass. The side door would not open. The emergency exit would not open. They were trapped. 12:39 a.m. The temperature on the furnace floor was rising. Without ventilation, the heat had nowhere to go. It was building, climbing. The air shimmered like water. One of the scabs found a window. He picked up a steel rod and swung it at the glass. The glass cracked but did not break, reinforced, designed to withstand explosions. He swung again and again. A small hole appeared. Not big enough for a man to fit through, barely big enough for a fist. Roy Tenner was shouting now, organizing his men, directing them to work together on the windows, to find tools, to find anything that could break through. But the smoke was getting worse, thick and black and choking. Men were coughing, covering their faces with their shirts, dropping to their knees where the air was slightly clearer. 12:43 a.m. Stanley watched from the shadows. His face was expressionless. His hands were steady at his sides. This was what he had wanted. This was what he had planned. 11 men dying in the same building where his father had died. 11 men who had taken what did not belong to them. 11 men who were paying the price for crossing a picket line. He should have felt satisfaction. He should have felt justice. He felt nothing. Roy Tenner was the last man standing. The others had collapsed, some from the smoke, some from the heat, some from sheer terror. They lay scattered across the furnace floor like broken dolls. Roy was at the main entrance, pounding on the door with his fists, screaming words that Stanley could not hear over the roar of the furnace. His clothes were soaked with sweat. His face was red and blistering. He stopped pounding. He turned around. He looked directly at the shadows where Stanley was standing. And somehow, through the smoke and the heat and the chaos, Roy Tenner saw him. Their eyes met. Roy's mouth moved. Stanley could not hear the words, but he could read them. Why? Stanley stepped out of the shadows. He walked toward the main entrance. He stopped 10 feet from where Roy Tenner stood, separated by a wall of smoke and heat. He spoke loud enough for Roy to hear. "You took what was ours." Roy shook his head. His voice was a rasp. a whisper, barely audible. "I just needed work." Stanley nodded. "I know." Roy's legs gave out. He slid down the door, leaving a wet streak on the metal. He looked up at Stanley with eyes that were already glazing over. "My children." Stanley thought about his own sons, about Joseph and Marek and Pavel, about the choices he had made to protect them, about the choices Roy Tenner had made to protect his. They were not so different. Not really. "I am sorry," Stanley said. He meant it. Roy Tenner closed his eyes. His chest rose once, twice. Then it stopped. 12:51 a.m. Stanley turned and walked away. He found Pavel in the maintenance corridor. His youngest son was on his knees. His body was shaking. Tears were running down his face. "I can hear them," Pavel said. "I can hear them dying." Stanley knelt beside his son. He put his hand on Pavel's shoulder. "It is done. We have to go." Pavel shook his head. I cannot move." Stanley gripped his son's arm. He pulled him to his feet. He looked into Pavel's eyes. "You can, you will. Because if you do not, everything we did tonight means nothing. Your brothers are waiting. Your mother is waiting. We go home. We never speak of this again. Do you understand?" Pavel stared at his father. The tears were still falling, but something in his eyes hardened. Something that had been soft before was soft no longer. "I understand." They found Marek at the rear exit. His face was blank. His hands were steady. He did not ask what had happened on the furnace floor. He did not need to. Joseph was waiting at the drainage culvert. He had blood on his knuckles. He did not explain where it came from. No one asked. They crawled through the culvert, one by one, emerging into the fog on the other side of the fence. They walked half a mile through abandoned streets to the truck. Joseph started the engine. He put the truck in gear. He drove. No one spoke. The fog swallowed them. The mill disappeared behind them. The sirens would not start for another hour when the day shift arrived and found the doors locked and the bodies on the floor. By then, Stanley Kowalski and his sons were home. The truck pulled up to Stanley's house at 1:47 a.m. The windows were dark. Helena was asleep, or pretending to be asleep. Stanley did not know which, and he did not ask. Joseph stayed in the truck. He would drive Marek and Pavel home, then take the truck to a junkyard in Beaver County, where a man owed him a favor. By morning, the truck would be crushed into a cube of metal. No evidence, no connection. Stanley stood on the sidewalk and watched his sons drive away. Then he walked into his house. He took off his boots at the door. His clothes were soaked with sweat and culvert water. They smelled like smoke and sulfur. He would burn them in the morning, build a fire in the backyard and watch them turn to ash. He went to the bathroom. He washed his hands. He washed them for a long time. The water ran clear, but he kept washing. His father's hands, his grandfather's hands, a killer's hands now. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was the same face it had always been. Weathered, lined, tired. But something was different. Something behind the eyes. He did not recognize the man staring back at him. He dried his hands. He walked down the hall to the bedroom. He opened the door. Helena was awake, sitting up in bed, watching the door. She did not ask where he had been. She did not ask what he had done. She simply lifted the blankets and made room for him beside her. Stanley climbed into bed. He put his head on the pillow. He closed his eyes. Helena's hand found his in the darkness. She held it tight. Neither of them slept. The discovery happened at 6:14 a.m. Thomas Brennan was 57 years old. He had worked at Monongahela Valley Steel for 33 years. He was a first helper on the day shift, a quiet man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. He had crossed the picket line every morning since the wildcat started, not because he supported the company, but because he had a mortgage and a wife with diabetes, and he could not afford to lose his job. Thomas arrived at Furnace Building 4 expecting to relieve the night shift. expecting to find Roy Tenner and his crew finishing the last heat of their rotation, expecting another ordinary day in a life full of ordinary days. The main entrance would not open. Thomas pushed. He pulled. He pounded on the door with his fist. Nothing. He walked around to the side entrance. Locked. A padlock he had never seen before hanging from the hasp. He walked to the emergency exit at the rear. Locked. The bolt thrown from the outside. Thomas Brennan stood in the cold November morning and felt something terrible growing in his chest. A knowledge he did not want to have. A certainty he could not escape. He ran to the nearest window. He cupped his hands against the glass and looked inside. The scream that came out of him was not a human sound. It was something older, something that came from a place beyond words. Bodies, scattered across the furnace floor, some near the doors, some near the windows, some huddled together in corners, arms wrapped around each other, faces frozen in expressions of terror. Thomas Brennan fell to his knees. He vomited on the frozen ground. He kept screaming until other workers came running, until someone called the police, until the sirens started and did not stop. The Allegheny County Sheriff's Department arrived at 6:31 a.m. The fire department arrived 3 minutes later. They cut through the padlock on the side door and entered the building. The heat hit them first. Even with the ventilation restored, even with the doors open, the temperature inside was still over 90 degrees. The furnace had been running all night. It was still running now. Then the smell, smoke and sulfur and something else, something that the veteran firefighters recognized but would never describe to civilians. The smell of human bodies that had been cooked. They counted the dead. 11 men on the furnace floor, 2 security guards in the break room, unconscious but alive. Barely. The security guards were rushed to Mercy Hospital. One of them would recover fully. The other would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, his brain damaged by the blow to his head. The 11 men on the furnace floor were beyond help. The coroner arrived at 8:15 a.m. Dr. William Hendricks had been doing this job for 22 years. He had seen industrial accidents. He had seen murders. He had seen things that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. He had never seen anything like this. The bodies were arranged in a pattern, not random, deliberate. The men had died trying to escape, clawing at doors that would not open, pounding on windows that would not break, crawling toward any source of fresh air they could find. The official cause of death was smoke inhalation and thermal trauma. But Dr. Hendricks knew the truth. These men had been trapped, locked inside a building with no ventilation and a furnace running at full capacity. They had been cooked alive. This was not an accident. This was murder. Detective Frank Castellano caught the case. He was 44 years old, a Pittsburgh native, son of a steelworker, brother of a steelworker. He understood the mills. He understood the men who worked them. He understood what the strike had done to the community. He also understood, within an hour of arriving at the scene, exactly what had happened. The locks told the story. The main entrance had been secured from the outside with a bolt that had not been used in years. The side door had a brand new padlock. The emergency exit had been bolted shut from the loading dock. Someone had locked these men inside and let them die. Detective Castellano interviewed the surviving security guards. The one who could still speak described 2 attackers, one older, one younger. The older one had hit him. Fast, professional, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Castellano interviewed the day shift workers. He interviewed the strikers. He interviewed anyone who might have seen something, heard something, known something. The strikers said nothing. They looked at Castellano with flat eyes and shook their heads. They did not know anything. They had not seen anything. They had been home with their families all night. But Castellano saw something in those flat eyes. Something that looked like satisfaction. Something that looked like justice. He started building a list of suspects. 47 men had walked out with the wildcat strike. 47 men who had reason to hate the scabs. 47 men who knew the mill well enough to plan something like this. Castellano narrowed it down. He looked for men with military experience, men who knew violence, men who had the skills and the will to do something this brutal. 3 names rose to the top of his list: Stanley Kowalski, Josef Kowalski, Marek Kowalski. Father and sons, all veterans, all strikers, all men with intimate knowledge of Furnace Building 4. Castellano started watching them. The arrest came 6 days later, November 19th, 1979. A Tuesday, clear and cold, the kind of day when you could see for miles. Stanley was sitting on his front porch when the police cars pulled up. 3 of them, unmarked, moving slowly, like predators approaching wounded prey. He had been expecting them. He had been expecting them since the morning after. The only surprise was that it had taken so long. Detective Castellano got out of the lead car. He walked up the path to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Stanley Kowalski?" Stanley nodded. "I need you to come with me. We have some questions about what happened at the mill." Stanley stood up slowly. His joints ached. His body felt old in a way it had not felt before. The weight of what he had done had settled into his bones. Helena appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale. Her hands were trembling. Stanley turned to her. He spoke quietly, calmly. "Call Joseph. Tell him to get a lawyer. Tell him I love him." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "Stanley, do not cry. Not in front of them. We are Kowalskis. We do not cry in front of strangers." He walked down the steps. He held out his hands. Castellano looked at him for a long moment. "Are you confessing?" Stanley shook his head. "I am not saying anything until I have a lawyer." Castellano nodded. He gestured to one of the uniformed officers. The officer produced handcuffs. "Stanley Kowalski, you are under arrest for the murders of Roy Tenner, William Marsh, David Collins, Robert Harding, James Stewart, Michael Novak, Thomas Peters, Donald Wright, Kevin Murray, George Baker, and Frank Patterson. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Stanley listened to the words. He had heard them before, on television, in movies. They meant nothing now. Words were just sounds. Only actions mattered. The officer put the handcuffs on. Stanley felt the cold metal against his wrists. He looked back at the house one last time. At the door where Helena stood watching. At the windows where he had watched his sons grow up. At the garden where they had played as children. Then the police put him in the car and drove him away. Josef was arrested 2 hours later. Marek was arrested that afternoon. Pavel was arrested the following morning. The community split in 2. Half of Pittsburgh called them monsters, murderers, animals who had killed 11 innocent men in the most horrific way imaginable. The newspapers ran photographs of the victims. Roy Tenner smiling with his children. William Marsh on his wedding day. David Collins in his army uniform. 11 faces. 11 lives. 11 families destroyed. The other half of Pittsburgh said nothing publicly. But privately, in kitchens and bars and union halls, they said something different. Those scabs knew what they were doing when they crossed that line. Nobody made them take those jobs. I am not saying it was right, but I understand it. Father Wojciechowski at Immaculate Heart of Mary refused to condemn the Kowalskis from the pulpit. He refused to praise them either. He simply prayed for all the dead, for all the families, for a community that had been torn apart by forces beyond anyone's control. The women of Polish Hill brought food to Helena. Pierogi and golubki and kielbasa, the same dishes they brought to every family in crisis. They did not ask questions. They did not offer opinions. They simply filled her kitchen with food she could not eat and sat with her in silence. Maria, Pavel's fiancée, visited Helena once. She returned the engagement ring. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Her eyes said everything. The wedding was off. The future they had planned was gone. She would never be a Kowalski now. Helena put the ring in a drawer and did not look at it again. The trial began in April of 1980. The venue was moved to Philadelphia. No jury in Pittsburgh could be impartial. Half would want to hang the Kowalskis. The other half would want to give them medals. The prosecution presented its case over 3 weeks. Physical evidence, witness testimony. The security guard who had survived identified Stanley as the man who attacked him. A clerk at a hardware store in Greensburg identified Stanley as the man who bought the padlock. A neighbor reported seeing Joseph's truck driving toward the mill on the night of the murders. The defense argued temporary insanity, emotional disturbance caused by the stress of the strike, the desperation of men who had been abandoned by the system. The lawyers brought in psychologists who testified about the effects of economic trauma. They brought in sociologists who testified about the breakdown of community bonds. The jury did not buy it. The planning was too careful. The execution was too precise. These were not men who had snapped. These were men who had made a decision and carried it out with military efficiency. The deliberation took 4 days. Guilty. All counts. All 4 defendants. Stanley Kowalski was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joseph Kowalski received the same sentence. Marek Kowalski received life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Pavel Kowalski, because of his youth and lesser role, received 25 years to life. The judge, before pronouncing sentence, asked if any of the defendants wished to make a statement. Stanley stood. He looked at the families of the victims seated in the gallery. 11 widows, dozens of children, faces twisted with grief and rage. He spoke slowly, clearly, without emotion. I am sorry for your loss. I am sorry for your pain. I am not sorry for what I did. Those men took jobs that did not belong to them. They crossed a line that should never be crossed. In my world, that has consequences. In your world, it has consequences too. We are all living with those consequences now. I hope, someday, you find peace. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. He sat down. The courtroom was silent. The judge pronounced sentence. The bailiffs led the defendants away. The trial was over. Stanley Kowalski served his sentence at the State Correctional Institution at Graterford. He was a model prisoner, quiet, respectful. He worked in the prison workshop, making furniture. The same hands that had poured steel for 31 years now sanded wood and drove nails. He found a certain peace in the work, a simplicity that he had never known outside. Helena visited every Sunday for 12 years. She took 3 buses to get there, 4 hours each way. She never missed a visit, not once, until her health made the journey impossible. She died in 1991. Heart failure. She was 67 years old. Stanley learned about her death from a prison chaplain. He sat in his cell for 3 days without eating, without speaking. The guards left him alone. Even murderers were allowed to grieve. After Helena's death, Stanley stopped writing letters, stopped receiving visitors, stopped engaging with the world outside the walls. He worked, he ate, he slept, he waited for the end. It came on February 14, 2003, Valentine's Day. Stanley Kowalski died in the prison infirmary of complications from lung disease. The doctors said it was probably related to his years of exposure to furnace fumes. The mills had killed him after all, just slowly. He was 77 years old. He had spent 23 years behind bars. His body was claimed by his sons. He was buried next to Helena in the cemetery at Immaculate Heart of Mary. The headstone read, Stanley Kowalski, 1926-2003. Beloved husband and father. Nothing else. No mention of the mills. No mention of the murders. Just a name and 2 dates and a simple statement of love. Joseph Kowalski died in prison in 1998. He was 49 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, but the men who knew him said he had been dying since Vietnam, since his divorce, since the night he helped his father lock 11 men inside a burning building. The heart attack just made it official. Marek Kowalski was paroled in 2012 after serving 32 years. He was 60 years old. His wife Anna had divorced him in 1985. His children had changed their names and moved away. He emerged from prison into a world he did not recognize, a world of cell phones and internet and a Pittsburgh that had transformed itself into something unrecognizable. He lived in a halfway house for 6 months. Then he found a room in a boarding house in McKeesport. He worked as a janitor at a community center. He did not speak to anyone about his past. He attended Mass every Sunday at a church where no one knew his name. He died in 2019, alone. His body was not discovered for 3 days. Pavel Kowalski was paroled in 2006 after serving 26 years. He was 49 years old. Of all the Kowalskis, Pavel suffered the most. He had been 23 on the night of the murders, young enough to still believe in fairness, young enough to still have hope. Prison had taken that from him. Prison had taken everything. He tried to rebuild. He got a job at a warehouse. He rented an apartment. He even started dating a woman he met at a support group for ex-convicts. But the memories would not leave him alone. The sound of men pounding on doors, the smell of smoke and burning flesh, the look in Roy Tenner's eyes as he slid to the floor. Pavel had been there. Pavel had helped. Pavel had done what his father asked, and Pavel could not live with it. On the morning of March 3, 2008, Pavel Kowalski walked to the Monongahela River, the same river that had carried barges of coal and steel for 100 years, the same river that had witnessed the rise and fall of an industry. He left a note in his apartment. 2 sentences. I am sorry. I should have said no. His body was found 3 days later, 6 miles downstream. He was 51 years old. The Monongahela Valley Steel Works closed in 1984. The building stood empty for a decade. Then the developers came. The furnaces were torn down. The smokestacks were demolished. The land was paved over and turned into a shopping center. Today, there is a Target where Furnace Building 4 used to stand. Families push carts through aisles of cleaning supplies and electronics, walking over the ground where 11 men died. They do not know. They have no reason to know. The only marker is a small plaque near the entrance to the shopping center. It reads, "On this site stood the Monongahela Valley Steel Works, 1908-1984. A memorial to the men who built America." It does not mention the massacre. It does not mention the Kowalskis. It does not mention Roy Tenner or the 10 men who died with him. History has a way of forgetting the things we would rather not remember. The house on Dobson Street still stands. The family that lives there now knows nothing of the Kowalskis. They bought the house in 1995, attracted by the low price and the quiet street. They have children who play in the same backyard where Stanley once tended his tomatoes. They eat dinner at the same table where 4 men planned 11 murders. Sometimes, late at night, the woman who lives there says she hears footsteps in the hallway, footsteps that stop outside the basement door. She tells herself it is the house settling. Old houses make noises. There is nothing to be afraid of. She is probably right. But sometimes she wonders, was Stanley Kowalski a murderer? Yes. He planned and executed the deaths of 11 men. He locked them inside a building and let them burn. He watched them die and felt nothing. By any legal or moral standard, he was a murderer. Was he a victim? Also, yes. He was a man who had given his life to a system that abandoned him, a man who had followed the rules for 53 years and discovered that the rules meant nothing, a man who had been betrayed by his union, his government, and his community. Was he justified? That is the question that has no answer. The men who crossed that picket line were not evil. They were desperate. They were doing what desperate men do. They were trying to survive in a world that had stopped caring about men like them. The men who locked those doors were not evil either. They were broken. They were abandoned. They had been pushed beyond the point where normal rules applied. Both sides were victims of the same collapse. Both sides were casualties of the same war. A war between workers and owners. A war between old ways and new ways. a war that nobody won. The steel mills are gone now. The jobs are gone. The communities that were built around those mills are shadows of what they once were. Polish Hill has new residents who work in hospitals and universities. Lawrenceville has coffee shops and art galleries where factories used to stand. The children of steelworkers became nurses and teachers and accountants. The grandchildren became software engineers and marketing managers. The great-grandchildren have never seen a blast furnace. They do not know what it means to pour steel at 2,800 degrees. The world moved on, but the questions remain. What do we owe to the men who build our cities and forge our steel and die in our factories? What happens when the systems that are supposed to protect them fail? What does a man become when everything he believed in is taken away? Stanley Kowalski answered those questions the only way he knew how: with fire, with violence, with a justice that was no justice at all. 11 men died because of his answer. 4 more lives were destroyed, and nothing changed. The mills still closed, the jobs still disappeared, the community still fractured. The Kowalskis rotted in prison while the world forgot why they were there. In the end, Stanley Kowalski's act of vengeance meant nothing. It did not save his job. It did not restore his dignity. It did not bring back the world he had lost. All it did was add more bodies to the pile. More widows, more orphans, more grief. That is the true lesson of the Pittsburgh Furnace Massacre. Violence does not heal. Violence does not restore. Violence only creates more violence, spiraling outward in waves that touch everyone they reach. Stanley Kowalski knew this. He knew it when he locked those doors. He knew it when he watched those men die. He knew it every day for 23 years, sitting in his cell, waiting for an end that would not come. He did it anyway. Because in that moment, in that terrible autumn of 1979, violence was the only language he had left. And that is the tragedy, not just for Stanley Kowalski, not just for the 11 men who died, but for all of us, for a world that creates these moments, that pushes men to the edge and then acts surprised when they fall over. The Pittsburgh Furnace Massacre was not an aberration. It was a symptom of a system that values profit over people, that discards workers when they are no longer useful, that abandons communities when the money dries up. We tell ourselves that we are different now, that we have learned, that we would never let things get that bad again. But the mills are still closing, the jobs are still disappearing. The men who built this country are still being thrown away like broken tools. And somewhere, right now, another Stanley Kowalski is sitting at a kitchen table, looking at bills he cannot pay, listening to politicians who do not care, watching strangers take what is his. He has not made his decision yet. But he is thinking about it. He is thinking very hard.